Okay, guys, today we are going to review Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Okay. We've already covered this in an earlier section. We covered a lot of this material in the Partition of Africa section, but this reading is a little different, and I wanted to go over this with you as well. Europeans made contact with Africans in the 1400s and traded along Africa's coasts for centuries. However, Europeans had never traveled very far beyond the coasts of the continent. In the mid-1800s, Europeans began exploring Africa's interior. One of the most famous explorers was Dr. David Livingstone, a Scottish minister. Livingstone began exploring Africa in 1841. For 30 years, he went back and forth across the continent. His goal was to find places to set up Christian missions. He traveled by foot, canoe, and mule. During his years in Africa, Livingstone had many adventures. For example, he was attacked by a lion and fought African warriors. He got to know the native languages and cultures of the regions he explored. Livingstone fell in love with Africa. In best-selling books, Livingstone wrote about his adventures and the beauty of Africa. Compared to his peers in Europe, Livingstone wrote about the African people with sympathy and respect. He was against the slave trade, which was still legal at the time of his travels. Livingstone thought that opening Africa's interior to Christianity and trade would help to end the slave trade. He said Europeans should send missionaries and merchants to Africa in order to bring, quote, civilization to the continent. During the late 1860s, Livingstone went into Central Africa looking for the source of the Nile River. Nobody heard from him for several years, and people thought he had died. A journalist named Henry Stanley went looking for Livingstone, and in 1871 he found him. Stanley greeted Livingstone with a phrase that is now famous. "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" Stanley did not share Livingstone's sympathy for Africans. He went on to work for King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold hired Stanley to explore the Congo River basin and arrange treaties with African leaders. The Congo was home to valuable natural resources. First of all, the Congo was home to the Congolese people, the people of the area, but it was home to valuable natural resources like copper and especially rubber. Leopold said he wanted to make life better for Africans, but he was most interested in conquering areas and making a profit. When Leopold claimed the Congo, other European countries raced to start their own colonies in Africa. By 1914, Africa had been divided up by Great Britain, Belgium, France, Italy, Germany, Spain, and Portugal. Africans were given little or no control over the governments of the colonies. Liberia and Ethiopia were the only free states left. Okay. Question number 1 here asks us, Europeans began exploring Africa's interior in the blank. If we go back in the reading, we realize that that took place in the mid-1800s. Took place in the mid-1800s. One of the most famous explorers, of course, was Dr. Livingstone. Dr. Livingstone. His goal in exploring Africa, if we go up here, he was against the slave trade, but his goal was to set up Christian missions. He thought that he could open Africa's interior to Christianity. Okay? He was, after all, a Scottish minister. He was a minister. To find places to set up Christian missions. Here we go. There it is. King Leopold. King Leopold claimed. Leopold hired Stanley to explore the Congo. Okay. Leopold claimed the Congo. Okay. When he did that, other European countries started the race, what's called the scramble for Africa. And by blank, Africa had been divided up by European powers. This is in 1914. By 1914, Africa had been divided up by European powers. So here we go to the crossword. For my little answer sheet, I just put the questions here, but we can see this is filling in the crossword. And we start with 2 across here. Okay. Who was attacked by lions and fought African warriors? Well, of course, as we just read, this was Dr. Livingstone. Livingstone. Number 5, across, when Leopold claimed the Congo, European countries raced to start their own. Well, from the reading here, they raced to start their own colonies in Africa. Stanley was hired to explore the blank river basin. Well, here he didn't have Livingstone's sympathy. He worked for King Leopold. He hired him to explore the Congo River Basin. Congo River Basin. This area is often now called just Congo, or today it calls itself the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Number 7 across, until the 1800s, Europeans had never traveled far beyond the blank of Africa. Let's look. Forget where this was in here. Okay. Europeans had never traveled far beyond the coasts of the continent, okay, until the mid-1800s, when Europeans began to explore it. And they'd never traveled far beyond the coasts of Africa. So in the earlier reading, we looked at the map of Africa, where they had sort of settled and made some trading posts along the southern and western coast of Africa, and a little bit on the eastern coast. But in the 1800s, they got into the interior of the continent more. Livingstone, who had sympathy for Africa, okay, Livingstone thought that they should send missionaries and merchants in order to bring civilization to the continent. So he had sympathy for the Africans, but he thought that they didn't have civilization without Europeans' help. And so this calls back to the earlier reading we did, where even Livingstone, who was, by these accounts, a good guy, he still had a paternalistic attitude towards the Africans. He still sort of treated them like children who needed help. Okay. So he thought he was bringing them civilization, but that might not be a fair way to treat a continent of adult people. It's probably not fair to treat adults like they're children. People in Africa had a civilization there. They had one that they probably liked. Who was most interested in conquering areas and making a profit? Well, we know that this guy, okay, King Leopold II, okay, he wanted Stanley to make the treaties with the leaders so that he could go in there and conquer the areas and make a profit. This was especially done by extracting or taking the natural resources from the Congo, especially rubber. So Leopold, he wanted to make profit by forcing the people of the Congo to harvest rubber for him. And tonight's assignment, it goes into some details, some of the gruesome details of that. Africa was home to natural blank like copper and rubber. Well, I told you guys, first of all, Africa was home to people, okay, the Congolese people, or the people of that river valley. But then those people, they lived in a land where there were natural resources like copper and rubber. Compared to his peers, Livingstone wrote about the African people with sympathy and respect. Livingstone's peers were, as the text reads here, compared to his peers in Europe. Livingstone's peers were in Europe. Of course, Livingstone wrote about the beauty of Africa. Okay. And he originally went into Africa looking for the source of the blank river. Yeah. So it says here his goal was to set up Christian missions, but he went deep into the river into Central Africa looking for the source of the Nile River. Civilizations in the West, so Western civilizations like the Greeks and the Romans, had been sort of obsessed with finding the source of the Nile River for quite some time. And Livingstone, he sort of followed that same hunger for knowledge, and he went looking for the source. What he found, as we'll read in the extension activity, what he found was Victoria Falls, and said that those are the source of the Nile River. Of course, in order to have a waterfall, you have to have a river, so there was a source above that even. But Livingstone found, for the Europeans anyway, he found the Victoria Falls and said that they are the source of the Nile River. Which European country controlled most of Northwest Africa? Okay, so now we're looking at the map. We can see that north and west, or on this map, they are up and to the left. We can see this sort of shading here. Algeria, French West Africa, French Morocco, and Tunisia. These are shaded with French. So it was the French. It was France who controlled most of Northwest Africa. Which European country controlled Egypt? Well, we can see here is Egypt, right? And it's shaded the darkest. So it is the British who controlled Egypt. Question 3 asks, what do Ethiopia and Liberia have in common? So first of all, Ethiopia is over here in the eastern part of the continent, okay? And it says that they are independent. They are not controlled by any of these shaded areas, by any of these European nations. Ethiopia was independent. It was controlled by itself. Liberia is considered independent as well. Liberia had a more complicated history in that regard. In some ways, Liberia was actually a colony of the United States, but it was a colony settled by former slaves for the United States. And so after the Civil War in the United States, one of the plans from some people were to resettle the slaves back in the continent of Africa. Of course, the slaves, many of them were, of course, born in the United States. They were Americans by modern standards. They were American people, American citizens even. But they were settled back on this western coast of Africa as if this was their homeland. And so Liberia had an interesting history. We could go on and on about it. At any rate, Liberia and Ethiopia were considered independent. They were considered to not have been conquered by Europeans. I'm not sure that is as true for Liberia. Liberia was settled by Africans who were maybe not native Africans. They were Africans who had, for the most part, been born in the United States. Okay, in the extension activities, I mentioned Victoria Falls. Okay, this is a place that Dr. Livingstone had discovered. What is Victoria Falls? And we're going to find out 3 facts about Victoria Falls. So first of all, when we go and look, we find that Victoria Falls was first seen by Livingstone. Of course, Africans had seen it, but he was the first European to have discovered Victoria Falls. So he found what the Greeks and the Romans weren't able to find. Next, we know that it was believed to be the source of the Nile River. Now, this is complicated because to have a waterfall, you have to have a source of water above it. But this is as far as anyone wanted to go and consider it the source of the Nile River. The actual source is sort of a complicated answer. Funny enough, modern geographers consider the source of the Nile River to be up in the hills or the mountains of Ethiopia. There are 2 parts, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. We're not really here to talk about that. So another fact about the Victoria Falls is that they are in southern Africa. They're way down here, okay, in what's called the Great Lakes region of Africa. So sort of interesting. Question 2, if we chose this one, it says Ethiopia was an African nation that successfully stood up to the Europeans. 3 facts about Ethiopia. Well, first of all, from yesterday's reading, we know that Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom. It was led by Menelik II, and it modernized under Menelik II, and they were a Christian people for the most part. One of the ways that they were able to remain independent was that they had modernized their relationship with Christian nations in Europe. It made it easier for them to modernize and to take in some of Europe's successes during this time, and they were able to modernize their weaponry. They built roads and things like that in their country. And then finally, what we would learn by looking into this, and we'll talk more about as we talk about World War I and what led to World War I, Ethiopia was invaded by Italy. Okay, now Italy didn't have success in invading Ethiopia, or at least its success was limited. Italy took over what was later called Eritrea, which used to be part of Ethiopia. But the Italians had limited success in invading Ethiopia. Okay, and then extension question 3 is more of an opinion. Would you spend that much time learning about something? Would you spend 30 years studying to learn about something? Well, I can say that many people do spend their lifetimes doing study. These are people we consider academics or scientists, historians, and things like that. And so, your answers may vary here, but if you use this one, I hope you explained your answer. Okay, and so this is Dr. Livingstone, I presume. This is one of a handful of takes we will have on imperialism in Africa and the forms that took. Okay.